He was an ordinary farmer and couldn't understand why his chickens refused to enter their coop for weeks. But one evening, he decided to look inside, and what he saw made him call 911 immediately. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching from. The air in the southern Arkansas clung to the skin like damp cotton that early summer, heavy with the scent of tilled soil and the slow hum of cicadas rising from the hedgerows. Marcus Reed's farm sat at the end of a red clay road where the telephone lines dipped low and dust never quite settled after a passing truck. His father had built the small farmhouse decades ago on wooden stilts to keep the spring floods from swallowing the floorboards. Now the paint was sun-bleached and cracked. The porch swing creaked in rhythm with the evening wind, and the fields shimmered in long green rows beneath the dying light. Marcus had inherited everything after his father's death 3 years prior: land, debts, an old Ford truck, and a weathered hen house behind the tool shed. It wasn't a big farm, barely enough to sell a few crates of eggs and vegetables at the local market, but it was his. He kept it running alone, the way his father had done after his mother passed. His days followed a strict rhythm. Before dawn, he'd check the irrigation lines, mend a fence, feed the birds, and by sundown he'd circle back through the fields, counting each small motion of the world as proof the land was still alive. Lately, though, that rhythm had started to crack. The first thing he noticed was silence. Not the calm silence of the fields at dusk, but a nervous quiet that trembled around the hen house when night began to fall. The chickens no longer followed their habitual march through the open door once the sky dimmed. Instead, they clustered near the fence, pacing and muttering as if something invisible blocked their way. Marcus thought little of it the first night. Perhaps a stray dog had scared them or the smell of feed had gone stale. But the second night was the same. And the third. He stood by the coop, hands on his hips, watching as the flock scattered and hopped onto the lower branches of the pear trees behind the shed. Their pale bodies glowed faintly under the moon, restless shapes twisting against the leaves. They would not step beyond the threshold of the coop, no matter how softly he coaxed them. The next morning, he found the ground beneath those trees littered with feathers and droppings. The inside of the coop remained untouched. No fresh tracks, no droppings, no signs of sleep. He told himself it was a temporary quirk. Animals change moods with weather, and the heat this year was merciless. Yet, something about the way the chickens froze when he tried to herd them inside unsettled him. They stared at the coop as if listening. The stillness inside it was wrong, deeper than night air should allow, thick and unmoving, like the breath had been drawn out of that wooden box and never returned. That evening, he fetched his lantern and went inside. The smell hit first: stale straw, dust, and something metallic that reminded him faintly of a rusted bucket left too long in the rain. He checked the nests, shifted the straw, tapped the boards to test for rot. Nothing unusual showed itself. When he leaned down to sweep a corner, a faint scraping sound traveled beneath the floorboards. He froze, listening. It could have been a rat, but the noise was slow, deliberate, like something dragging along the packed earth. After a long minute, it stopped. Outside, the chickens stirred again, agitated by something only they could sense. Marcus stepped out, wiped the sweat from his brow, and stared at the horizon where the last light drained away behind the trees. His father used to say that animals felt the earth better than people did, that they could tell when the ground was wrong or when a storm was brewing long before clouds appeared. He thought of that now, of the way his father would stand by the coop with his coffee, saying quietly, If the hens won't go home, boy, it means the home ain't safe." That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He lay on the porch in an old wicker chair, listening to the farm's uneasy breathing. The wind carried the soft clank of the gate, the rasp of branches against tin. Somewhere, far off, a dog barked and fell silent. When the moon reached its peak, he glanced toward the henhouse and thought he saw movement near the base of the wall, a brief shiver of the earth no larger than a ripple on water. He told himself it was imagination, that fatigue and heat were tricking his eyes. Yet, when dawn came, he found a shallow depression near the corner of the coop, the soil slightly pushed upward as if something beneath had pressed towards the surface during the night. He crouched there, running his fingers through the clay. It was still damp, though there'd been no rain for days. Beneath his touch, the earth seemed to pulse faintly with warmth. A shiver crept up his arm. He filled the depression with fresh dirt, tamped it down, and walked away without looking back. But the feeling followed him all day, lingering at the edge of thought, whispering that whatever had unsettled the chickens had roots deeper than any predator's den. By sunset, the air grew heavy again, soaked in gold and dust. Marcus leaned against the fence, watching his flock huddle nervously under the trees. He felt the weight of the unseen pressing on the farm, as if the ground itself held a memory it refused to release. The cicadas fell silent for a moment, and in that pause he heard the faint creak of a board within the coop, a slow bending sound that spoke not of wind or decay, but of something shifting inside. The last of the light slipped away, and the first stars trembled above the horizon. The henhouse stood in silhouette, door slightly ajar, black as a mouth that had swallowed too much time. Marcus turned away only when the cold breath of night settled across his shoulders. He did not notice the fresh crack forming along the base of the coop, thin as a vein in the earth, nor the quiet pulse beneath it that kept time with his heartbeat as he walked back to the house. Morning came with a thin mist curling over the fields, softening the edges of the world. Marcus rose before sunrise, his body aching from another restless night. The first sound that greeted him was silence again, the kind of stillness that comes after something has disturbed nature's rhythm. He walked toward the coop, boots sinking slightly into the damp earth, and saw the hens gathered under the pear tree, half asleep on their perches, feathers puffed and eyes dull. None had gone inside. The open door of the henhouse gaped at him, unwelcoming, like a mouth that exhaled cold air from its depths. He decided that morning he would fix whatever was wrong. The building was old, the boards swollen from years of rain, the hinges rusted. He began by pulling the door off its frame, replacing the loose screws, and oiling the latch until it moved silently. He swept the floor, scraped away the caked straw, and gathered it into a wheelbarrow. When he threw the damp clumps onto the compost pile, a faint metallic smell clung to his gloves, the same scent he had noticed before. It was not the smell of rust exactly, but of something old that had lived too long underground. He spread fresh straw, added new feed, and washed the trough with bleach. He installed a new perch made of smooth pine, the kind his father used to build, and hung a soft amber lamp above the nesting boxes to keep the interior warm and bright. From the outside, the coop now looked almost new, the boards scrubbed clean, the nails glinting. He stepped back, feeling a small measure of pride. Surely now the chickens would feel safe again. That evening, when the sky began to dim, Marcus opened the gate and scattered a trail of grain leading straight into the doorway. The birds followed him at first, pecking eagerly at the ground, clucking as they went, but as they neared the entrance, their pace slowed. The first hen stopped abruptly, neck extended, eyes fixed on the darkness within. One by one, the others froze behind her. A low murmur rippled through the flock, soft, uneasy, like the sound of distant wind and dry grass. Then, with a sudden flutter, they broke away, scattering toward the trees as if driven by an unseen force. Marcus stood there, the bucket in his hand, watching the doorway. Nothing moved inside. The warm light he had hung swayed gently, illuminating the straw, the perches, the grain. It looked harmless, even inviting. But the birds would not cross the threshold. He called to them softly, the way he used to as a boy, yet they ignored him, retreating farther into the shadows of the yard. That night, he sat on the porch again, sipping coffee gone cold, thinking. There had to be a reason for their fear. He remembered when a fox had once taken a hen years ago, how the birds refused to use the coop for days afterward. Perhaps another predator had come, something that had left no visible trace. He fetched his flashlight and searched the perimeter, looking for burrows, claw marks, or feathers, anything that might explain it. The earth was smooth, undisturbed, except near the same corner where he'd noticed the small depression the night before. Now it seemed slightly larger. Kneeling, he pressed his hand to the ground. It felt cool but soft, like fresh clay turned after rain. A faint odor of soil and rot lingered there, and beneath it, again, that strange metallic tang. He dug his fingers deeper, expecting to find damp wood or the nest of a mole. Instead, his fingertips struck something hard, a splinter of brick perhaps, though the farm had no brick foundations. He brushed away the dirt until a rough red surface appeared, uneven and brittle with age. He stood up quickly, dust in his hands, uneasy at what he'd found. The coop had been built decades ago, long before he was born, and his father had only ever replaced boards, never the base. Why would there be brick under a wooden floor? He tried to push the question away, telling himself it was likely leftover material from the house's construction or part of some forgotten root cellar. But the thought stayed, heavy and insistent. That night the air refused to cool, thick as breath held too long. Marcus left his windows open, hoping the crossbreeze would help him sleep. Around midnight, he woke suddenly to the sound of something shifting outside, a dry scrape followed by a dull thump. He reached for his flashlight and stepped onto the porch. The farm stretched before him in shades of gray, motionless except for the low sway of the trees. Then came another sound, faint but unmistakable. A slow creak from the direction of the coop, like a board bending under weight. He crossed the yard barefoot, the flashlight beam trembling across the grass. The door of the coop hung half open again, though he had latched it before bed. He stopped a few feet away, the beam of light cutting across the straw inside. Nothing moved. Only the soft glimmer of the lamp reflecting off the empty feed tray. Yet the smell was stronger now, damp, sour, and laced with that old iron scent. The floor seemed darker near the far wall where the shadows thickened. For a long moment, he stared into the gloom, waiting for something to shift. When nothing did, he shut the door, secured the latch with a piece of wire, and went back to bed without looking behind him. The next day, he worked the fields, trying to bury his thoughts beneath the rhythm of his chores. By noon, the sun blazed white and sweat slicked his back. But every so often his eyes drifted toward the henhouse. It sat there quietly, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching him somehow. When he walked by, the air grew slightly cooler, the smell of earth and decay faintly noticeable even in the heat. That evening, he visited his neighbor Henry, an old man who had lived on the next property for more than 60 years. Henry was sitting on his porch, whittling wood, when Marcus arrived. They talked about the weather, the drought, and the price of corn. Then Marcus mentioned the chickens. The old man stopped carving, knife still in his hand, and frowned. "Animals know when the ground ain't right," he said after a pause. "They feel it before we do. Some places just carry what happened on them, and it don't ever fade." Marcus tried to laugh it off, but Henry didn't smile. "This whole stretch of land's been here since before the war," the old man continued. "My granddaddy used to say parts of it were dug through more than once. Folks hid things they didn't want found. People, too, sometimes." He glanced toward Marcus's farm, the fading light glinting in his pale eyes. "If your birds don't want to go in there, you best listen. Ain't always snakes or foxes that scare 'em." On the walk home, the words clung to Marcus like burrs. The evening had turned purple and thick, the sun bleeding out behind the tree line. He passed the coop and noticed something new. The faint outline of a crack running from the base of the wall outward through the dirt, just visible under the weeds. Kneeling, he traced it with his finger. The line felt warm, the soil around it soft, as if recently disturbed. When he pressed down, a whisper of air escaped, carrying that same metallic scent again. Inside the coop, everything was still. Yet the quiet no longer seemed empty. It was expectant, full of a presence he couldn't name. He leaned closer to the door, listening. From somewhere beneath the floor came a muffled sound, barely audible, like a small object rolling slowly across wood. He stepped back, heart pounding, unsure if it was real or his mind inventing echoes out of fear. The sky deepened to black, the first stars emerging above the roof. He shut the door once more, this time nailing a board across it for good measure, though he knew it wouldn't ease his mind. Back inside the house, he sat at the kitchen table, the faint glow of a single bulb painting long shadows on the walls. The smell of soil seemed to follow him, clinging to his boots. He thought of the depression near the coop, the brick fragment, the crack that breathed warm air. Something under that building was alive, or had been once, and the land was remembering. He poured himself a glass of water, drank it down in one gulp, and looked out the window again. The yard lay motionless beneath the moonlight, but his eyes caught the faint shimmer of movement near the hen house, as if the earth itself shifted in its sleep. Sleep came late, heavy and dreamless. But when he woke before dawn, a single realization pressed against his mind with the weight of inevitability. He could repair every board, replace every nail, but until he understood what lay beneath that floor, his chickens would never set foot inside again. The thought chilled him more than the morning air, because deep down he already suspected that what frightened the animals was not something that had just arrived. It was something that had been waiting there all along. The following evening came draped in an uneasy calm, as though the land itself held its breath. Marcus felt it long before darkness fell. Even the air tasted different, thicker, tinged with the faint sweetness of rot and rain, though no clouds hung above. The chickens huddled under the pear tree once more, restless and whispering among themselves. They would not come down, even as the last rays of sunlight bled away over the fields. When the farm sank into shadow, Marcus decided he'd had enough of waiting for answers to come to him. Tonight, he would stay awake and find out what had taken hold of his land. He gathered what he needed with slow, deliberate motions, as though afraid that any sudden gesture might stir something already listening. He set an old folding chair near the fence, close enough to watch the coop, but far enough to keep the flock from scattering. Beside him he placed his father's lantern, a thermos of coffee, and a worn notebook he sometimes used to track feed supplies. The evening hum of insects built like a tide, then receded until the only sound left was the occasional rustle of feathers from the trees. The first few hours passed in quiet monotony. Marcus scribbled notes in the dim light, charting every faint noise he heard. The world beyond the circle of lantern glow seemed to dissolve into ink. He could feel the pulse of the land under his boots, steady and slow, like a buried heartbeat. Every so often, a hen muttered softly to another, but otherwise the night was still. Around midnight the rhythm began to shift. The cicadas faltered, their endless droning fading into silence so complete it felt unnatural. The wind dropped too, leaving the leaves hanging motionless, suspended in the dark. Marcus took a sip of coffee, the bitter taste grounding him, and glanced toward the coop. The light of the lantern flickered across the boards. For a moment, everything looked ordinary. Then the faintest vibration rippled through the ground beneath his feet. He froze. It wasn't the sharp jolt of an animal's step, nor the deep rumble of a distant truck. It was subtle, rhythmic, something shifting below, steady as breathing. The chickens stirred, some flapping their wings nervously, their claws scratching the bark of the tree. Marcus strained to listen. The sound seemed to come from under the coop, a low scrape like wood dragging across stone. Then silence again. Minutes crawled by. He noted the time, forced himself to stay seated. His father used to tell him that fear on a farm was like a weed. If you fed it with imagination, it would take over the whole field. So, Marcus waited, eyes fixed on the dark outline of the hen house. But soon another sound came, a creak, longer and deeper, the unmistakable protest of an old floorboard bending under unseen weight. The light inside swayed, as though brushed by a current of air. The chickens reacted instantly. A low wave of panic ran through the flock. They rustled their feathers and hopped to higher branches, muttering in alarm. Marcus stood and took a step toward the coop, his heartbeat rising. The night had grown so still that the crunch of gravel under his boots sounded deafening. He reached the door and hesitated. The smell met him before the silence did, damp earth, sour hay, and beneath it that same metallic tang, sharp and cold, like the breath of something buried too long. He pushed the door open, the hinges whining softly. The lantern's beam slid over the straw, the walls, the perches. Everything looked exactly as it should. And yet the air inside felt different, thicker, somehow older. He stepped in, careful not to make noise. The sound of his boots on the wooden floor seemed unnaturally loud, echoing slightly as if the boards hit a hollow space below. He crouched and ran his hand along one of the floorboards near the back wall. The wood was cold, even in the sticky heat of summer. As he pressed down, a faint shiver ran through it, as though the plank were resting on something not entirely solid. He tapped it gently with his knuckle and heard the soft, unmistakable tone of air beneath. Not solid ground, an empty space. Marcus stayed there, frozen in half-crouch, staring at the shadowed corners of the coop. The realization struck with a cold, methodical clarity. The structure wasn't built on pure earth. Something lay underneath it, a cavity, a tunnel maybe. His mind raced through possibilities, an old storm shelter, a forgotten well, the remnants of a foundation his father never mentioned. Yet none of those explanations accounted for the strange behavior of the chickens, or for the smell that seemed to rise from the boards themselves. He stood slowly, his knees creaking. The lamp swung slightly in his hand, sending slices of light across the straw. Dust floated lazily in the air, catching gold for a heartbeat before vanishing again. In the far corner, where the walls met the floor, a hairline crack traced along the wood. It hadn't been there before. The faint draft that escaped from it was cool, not the warm air of the summer night, but the cold exhale of something untouched by sun or wind for many years. He stayed inside longer than he intended, watching, listening. The quiet pressed down like weight. Outside, the hens had gone still again. Their silence was almost reverent. Marcus felt an odd mixture of dread and curiosity tighten in his chest. He wanted to tear up the boards right then, to see what secrets the earth was keeping. But another part of him, the part that remembered his father's cautious wisdom, told him to wait until daylight. Darkness made men foolish. When he stepped out into the yard, the night air hit him like water. He realized he'd been holding his breath. The trees loomed, black against a starlit sky. The world smelled of dew and soil and something older that he couldn't name. The crack near the wall seemed to glimmer faintly, the moonlight catching on the damp edges of the wood. He moved his chair closer to the fence and sat again, eyes fixed on the door. The hours stretched. He dozed once or twice, jerking awake at the smallest sound, the whisper of a branch, the faint scrape of a feather. Around 3 a.m, he thought he saw the ground shift again, a ripple moving outward from the corner of the coop, subtle but undeniable. He blinked, leaned forward, and saw it once more, a slow settling, like soil being disturbed from underneath. The hens rustled uneasily in the trees, but none dared call out. By the time the first hint of dawn touched the horizon, the air felt thick and tired. Marcus stood and stretched his stiff legs, his neck sore from tension. He walked to the coop one last time, kneeling near the base where the crack had widened slightly overnight. He brushed his fingers along it. The wood felt faintly warm this time, as if it had absorbed the heartbeat of whatever lay below. The rising sun spilled light across the farm, and suddenly everything looked ordinary again, too ordinary. The hens fluttered down from their perches, pecking at the ground as though nothing had ever happened. The air carried the clean scent of morning dew. For a moment, Marcus doubted his memory, wondered if exhaustion had warped his senses. But when he looked down again, the crack was still there, and the faint exhalation of cold air still breathed through it. He straightened and stared at the structure. The boards glowed soft gold under the morning light, their rough edges illuminated like scars. He knew what he had to do now. There was no comfort left in ignorance. Whatever hid beneath that floor had been waiting for far too long. Tonight had shown him that it was no passing disturbance or wandering creature. The coop itself was only a lid, nailed shut over something that had always been there. Marcus turned back toward the house, the decision already forming in his mind. He would uncover it, carefully, methodically, the way his father had taught him to approach any problem that couldn't be solved by instinct alone. But he also knew that when he lifted those boards, there would be no turning back. Behind him, the sun rose higher, and the land seemed to exhale. Yet, even as warmth crept over the fields, a strange heaviness clung to the air. The chickens kept their distance from the coop, circling it warily, as though they too understood that something beneath their feet had awakened. The farm looked peaceful again, but Marcus could no longer mistake that peace for safety. He felt the weight of the coming day settle over him, the quiet before revelation, the stillness that comes when the earth prepares to give up its secrets. The following morning dawned with a light mist crawling across the fields, silver threads stretching through the air before the sun could burn them away. Marcus stood at his window, staring at the faint outline of the henhouse, its silhouette ghostly in the haze. He had hardly slept, and the coffee in his hands was more ritual than comfort. The decision he'd made in the quiet hours of dawn settled heavy in his chest. He could no longer look at the structure as a simple shelter for birds. It had become something else, a sealed mouth of earth that whispered when the world went still. By mid-morning, he gathered what tools he thought he'd need. His father's old crowbar, a hammer, a few chisels, and a hand trowel. He fetched a brush from the barn, the kind he used to clean rust from machinery, and a small flashlight. He moved slowly, with a kind of reverence, as if preparing for a funeral rather than a repair. When he reached the coop, the chickens had already fled to the far end of the yard, silent and alert. The air hung motionless, the usual farm sounds, crickets, cicadas, even the sigh of wind through trees, seeming to fade at the edges of hearing. He opened the door and stepped inside. The smell of stale straw had thickened overnight, now cut through with the scent of damp clay and something else, something faintly organic, like roots left too long in the ground. The light, filtering through the gaps in the boards, made thin golden stripes across the floor, and in those slanted beams he could see dust swirling lazily, refusing to settle. Marcus knelt near the back wall where the floor had begun to sink. The boards here were darker, the wood warped slightly, as though it had absorbed years of moisture rising from beneath. He pried at the edges with the crowbar, the nails screeching softly in protest before they gave way. When he lifted the first plank, a breath of cool air escaped, carrying with it that unmistakable metallic odor, old, sharp, and somehow human. He crouched over the gap, directing the beam of his flashlight into the darkness below. The light hit something red, brick, not dirt, and his stomach turned. He widened the opening carefully, sliding the crowbar under the next board. Beneath the layer of compacted soil lay a structure of handmade bricks, uneven in color, each one worn smooth at the edges. He brushed away loose dirt, revealing more of the pattern. The bricks formed a curve, a shallow arch, like the roof of a tunnel or a low chamber. A wave of cold washed over him as he realized he wasn't looking at a random patch of old construction. The bricks had been laid deliberately, forming what looked like the ceiling of a hidden room. He set his tools aside and used his hands, scooping soil away from the gap. Within minutes, he had cleared enough space to see that the chamber continued deeper, the air rising from it chill and stale, carrying the faint scent of burnt wood and something darker underneath. Marcus sat back on his heels, his heart beating fast. He had grown up on this land, and he knew every inch of it, every fence post, every tree root, every hollow. Yet here was a space beneath his feet he had never imagined existed. He thought of his father, of all the times the man had replaced boards, patched holes, or muttered about keeping the floor sturdy. Was it possible his father had known something was down there? As he worked deeper, the flashlight's beam fell upon something half buried at the edge of the chamber. A small length of iron, looped at one end, and its surface rusted and pitted. He reached in, fingers brushing metal that was shockingly cold, and pulled it free. It was a short chain, the kind used to secure livestock, but lighter, thinner, meant for something smaller. At the end of it hung a tiny padlock, its keyhole clogged with dirt. The discovery made him pause. He stared at the chain in his hand, the weight of it disproportionate to its size. A sudden image formed in his mind, A person sitting in that dark space, the chain hooked to the wall, the air heavy with fear and smoke. He shook the thought away, unwilling to follow it. But the ground beneath him seemed to pulse faintly, as if the memory itself lived within the clay. He returned to work, prying up more boards. The coop floor soon gaped open in a rough rectangle, revealing the full curve of the brick vault below. The air that rose through it was ancient, cool, and unmoving. He could see faint traces of black on the walls, soot perhaps, and the remnants of something wooden resting against the side. It might once have been a bench or a crate, but now it was little more than splinters and shadow. Marcus fetched a small spade and began to dig through the loose soil near the opening. Within minutes, his spade struck something hollow that gave a dull, brittle sound. He brushed the dirt aside and found the corner of a wooden box, its surface soft and dark from age. When he pulled it free, the lid crumbled at his touch, revealing nothing inside but dust and a few rusted nails. Still, the box had been placed there for a reason. It meant someone had lived, or hidden, down there long enough to leave traces of purpose. He sat back, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool air seeping from below. Every instinct told him this was no ordinary find. This was not the remnant of a tool shed or the forgotten work of builders. It was deliberate, secret, meant to remain unseen. He switched off the flashlight and let his eyes adjust to the thin daylight filtering through the cracks above. For a long moment, he just listened. The silence felt alive now, layered with memory. He could almost hear faint echoes beneath it, the rhythmic scrape of metal, a whisper of breath, the faint murmur of voices long gone. By midday, the sun had burned through the mist, but inside the coop it remained dim and cold. Marcus continued to uncover the chamber inch by inch, moving with the precision of someone handling bones. When the opening was large enough, he lay on his stomach and peered down into the darkness. The brickwork was well made, carefully laid, though time had gnawed at it. In one corner, he could see faint white markings on the wall, lines, maybe letters. He angled the flashlight until the words came into focus. They were written in charcoal, rough but unmistakable. Deliver us. The letters were old, the strokes faint and flaking, but their plea still lived in the stone. Marcus's throat tightened. He wanted to tell himself it was nothing. Children's graffiti, some forgotten prank. But the depth of the chamber, the chain, the soot, the bones of the bench, all whispered of confinement. He climbed out and sat in the doorway, staring across the yard towards a pear tree. The chickens watched him in wary silence, their eyes black and unblinking. He thought of the nights they refused to enter the coop, of their panic, of their strange intuition. They had sensed this place, the residue of suffering that no amount of sunlight could erase. As afternoon wore on, Marcus cleaned his tools and went to the house to fetch his phone. His hands trembled as he dialed the number for the county historical office. When a secretary answered, he struggled to explain exactly what he'd found. "It's an old brick room," he said finally. "Under my chicken coop. Looks like it's been sealed for a long time. You might want to send someone out." When he hung up, he stood at the window watching the light fade across the fields. The day had turned quiet again, almost gentle, yet he could not shake the feeling that something beneath the ground was stirring, newly aware of being discovered. That night, Marcus couldn't eat. The images kept replaying in his mind. The chain, the writing, the small wooden box. He wondered how many people had passed through that hidden space, and whether any had made it out alive. He imagined them waiting in silence as footsteps passed overhead, their hearts beating against the earth. He thought of the warmth that had seeped through the floorboards in the weeks before, that subtle pulse the chickens had sensed. Perhaps it wasn't warmth at all, but memory pressing upward through time, demanding to be found. When darkness finally came, he returned to the coop once more. The moon was high, casting a cold, silver light over the fields. The opening in the floor yawned wide beneath him, the air from below almost sweet now in its chill. He crouched beside it, the flashlight trembling in his grip, and whispered softly into the dark, though he wasn't sure why. "I found you." The sound of his voice seemed to sink into the earth, swallowed without echo. For a moment, he thought he felt a faint shift in the air, a sigh almost, or a settling. Then silence again. He rose and closed the coop door behind him, leaving the boards open, the chamber exposed to the night. The decision to call the historians had been right. This was no mystery meant for one man to shoulder alone. Still, as he walked back to the house, he couldn't shake the feeling that the past was not yet finished with him. It had waited too long beneath the weight of soil and wood, and now that he had disturbed it, it would not go quietly back to sleep. In the darkness behind him, the coop stood like a monument, half ruin, half tomb, breathing the faint, cold breath of the buried world below. The following days unfolded with a strange, deliberate slowness, as though time itself had grown cautious of stepping too close to the truth. The morning after Marcus's discovery, the air hung heavy with anticipation. The farm, usually full of small familiar noises, the rustle of feathers, the creak of the well handle, the hum of wind through the corn, seemed to hold its breath. Even the chickens moved with unusual quiet, keeping their distance from the coop, as though the thing beneath it might stir again if they drew too near. Marcus felt the same weight pressing on his chest each time his eyes fell upon the open doorway and the dark, yawning hole that had once been an ordinary floor. True to his word, the County Historical Society sent a small team 2 days later. They arrived in a dusty white van bearing the emblem of the local museum, 3 people in work boots and broad-brimmed hats who introduced themselves with polite professionalism but carried an undercurrent of awe once Marcus showed them what he'd found. The leader was a woman named Dr. Ellen Marsh, a historical archaeologist from Little Rock. She moved with careful precision, her eyes taking in every detail, the tilt of her head betraying the quiet excitement of discovery. By mid-morning, she and her team had set up their equipment around the coop, laying out tarps, notebooks, and a series of small labeled containers. Marcus stood back and watched as they began to work, removing the remaining boards and brushing soil from the bricks. The soft sounds of trowels scraping earth filled the air, a rhythm at once methodical and reverent. It didn't take long before Ellen confirmed what Marcus had already begun to suspect. The bricks, she explained, were handmade and likely dated from the mid-1800s. The construction suggested a small hidden chamber, too low for ordinary use, too carefully sealed to have been a storage pit. "These were built for concealment," she said quietly, tracing the curvature of the arch with her gloved fingers. "I've only seen a few like this in the state. Most were used by those helping people escape during the late years of slavery. Safe houses, hidden cells, escape tunnels. The craftsmanship is consistent with that period." Marcus felt the words settle over him like dust. He'd read about such things, the Underground Railroad, the brave few who risked their lives to hide others, but he had never imagined one of those places might lie beneath his own farm, beneath his chickens and his ordinary life. The thought filled him with pride and unease in equal measure. It wasn't just history now, it was something intimate, something that had slept under his feet while generations of his family lived above it. As the team continued, more artifacts emerged. A small wooden spoon, blackened at the handle, fragments of pottery, their glaze long faded, and, most haunting of all, a length of rusted iron embedded in the corner of the chamber wall connected to a ring driven deep into the brick. The chain Marcus had found earlier fit perfectly into it. When Ellen examined it, she grew still for a long moment. "It's real," she murmured, "and it was used." Her voice dropped almost to a whisper, as though speaking too loudly might wake the ghosts of those who had once been trapped there. Near midday, as sunlight filtered through the cracks in the coop's walls, one of the assistants uncovered something unexpected. A human bone, small and brittle, no larger than a child's forearm. For several minutes, no one spoke. The weight of the moment pressed down upon them all. Marcus felt his stomach turn, not from fear, but from the terrible intimacy of it. Someone had died down there, close enough that their memory still breathed through the soil. Ellen's face softened with sorrow. "We'll document everything," she said. "If this was an escape chamber, it's possible that some who hid here never made it out. The tunnels often collapsed or were sealed in haste. But this place, it's an incredible find. You've preserved a piece of history that might have been lost forever." In the days that followed, the story spread quietly through the county. Local reporters arrived to take photographs, their curiosity mingled with reverence. Neighbors stopped by the fence, some offering cautious congratulations, others keeping their distance as though afraid that whatever Marcus had unearthed might bring the dead closer. At the grocery store in town, whispers followed him through the aisles. "That's the man with the hidden room," people would murmur. He found no satisfaction in their fascination. At night, the farm felt different. Even with the archaeologists gone for the day, he could still sense their tools lying in the dirt, the faint outline of the chamber under the moonlight. The air seemed charged, humming softly in the stillness. Sometimes, lying awake in bed, he thought he could hear something faint, a steady rhythm like the sound of footsteps moving across brick far below. He told himself it was the wind or the settling of earth, but a part of him wasn't sure. One evening, unable to rest, Marcus drove to the county library in town. He spent hours in the archives, combing through brittle newspaper clippings and land deeds, searching for any mention of his property's past. Finally, in a ledger dated 1859, he found a reference. A plantation once stood near the southern boundary of his land, owned by a man named Elijah Porter. The name meant nothing to him, but the records showed Porter's estate had burned during the war. Its boundaries later divided and sold. Marcus's farm occupied what had once been the far edge of that property. He read on, tracing faint ink that had bled through the fragile paper. Several accounts mentioned Porter's reputation as a strict master and rumors of a revolt that led to disappearances. Another entry hinted at an underground passage used during those years, a place where the guilty hid from justice. The language was vague, the tone more gossip than fact, but Marcus's hands trembled as he turned the page. He realized with quiet certainty that the chamber beneath his coop had not only witnessed desperation, it had borne the weight of human cruelty as well. When he returned home that night, the air was thick and silent. The chickens had all gone to roost in the pear trees again, though the new coop light glowed steadily. He walked past them and stood before the open excavation. The chamber below lay dark and still, the instruments of the archaeologists resting like relics on its edge. Kneeling, he whispered to the empty space, "You can rest now." The words came unbidden, and he didn't know to whom he was speaking, those who had hidden or those who had died. Perhaps both. The next morning, Ellen and her team returned to collect the final samples. They thanked Marcus for his patience and promised to include his name in their report. Before leaving, she turned to him with a grave expression. "You know, Mr. Reed," she said, "some discoveries don't belong only to history. They belong to memory. People should know what happened here. You could help tell that story." Her words lingered long after the van disappeared down the dirt road. Marcus spent the afternoon sitting on the porch, staring at the horizon where the land rolled out in soft green waves. He thought of his father again, of how the man had worked this soil all his life without ever suspecting what slept beneath it. Or perhaps he had known in some way, or had felt it in the weight of the air, the uneasy quiet after dusk. Maybe that was why he'd always spoken about the land with such caution, why he'd said that some parts of the farm remembered things better left alone. That evening, Marcus walked out to the coop one last time. The sun was low, spilling amber light across the yard. He stood at the edge of the pit and looked down at the exposed chamber, now half filled with shadow. The air rising from it was cool and still, smelling faintly of damp clay and old smoke. He imagined the people who had once huddled there, faces he'd never see, names he'd never know, waiting for nightfall, for freedom, or perhaps for death. The archaeologists would soon take their findings and fill the hole, sealing the chamber again, though not as tightly as before. Marcus had agreed it was best. The ground would be covered with a layer of gravel and earth, the site marked and protected. But as he stood there, he realized that no layer of soil could truly bury what had been uncovered. The land itself had been changed, and so had he. When darkness fell, he sat beneath the pear tree, watching the chickens settle. For the first time in weeks, they were calm, their soft murmurs blending with the gentle hum of night insects. The tension that had hung over the farm had eased, though a quiet solemnity remained, as if the very air now carried respect for what had been found. Marcus understood that the peace was not forgetfulness. It was acknowledgement. The earth had spoken, and he had listened. The days ahead would bring reporters, maybe historians, maybe even tourists curious to see the hidden history beneath a farmer's coop. But Marcus no longer feared it. The chamber, the bones, the names carved into brick, they were not curses upon his land. They were reminders that even the smallest patch of soil can hold an entire world of pain and courage, waiting centuries to be remembered. That night, as the moon climbed high, he stood one last time before the opening, the cool air brushing his face. He whispered again into the dark, "You're safe now." The words vanished into the hollow below, swallowed by silence that no longer felt empty but full of memory, full of presence, full of the long, unbroken hum of history finally at rest. For several nights after the archaeologists departed, the farm remained wrapped in a silence that felt almost sacred. The hum of insects returned. The breeze whispered through the corn once more, yet there was a stillness that had not existed before, a gentleness that seemed to come from beneath the soil itself. Marcus could feel it whenever he crossed the yard. The air no longer felt hostile or watchful. It was simply heavy with memory, as if the land was finally breathing in peace after centuries of holding its breath. He knew what he had to do. The discovery had changed everything. That building, that little wooden coop that had once stood as a simple shelter for hens could no longer remain. It was a relic of a kind of innocence he no longer possessed. Now, each time he looked at it, he saw not the faint scratches of chicken claws or the slant of sunlight across straw, but the outline of a chamber, the shadow of chains and the bones of the past pressing quietly beneath it. On a morning, thick with the smell of rain, Marcus fetched his tools from the barn. The air was cool, the sky heavy with a grayness that muted every sound. The chickens followed him at a distance, curious but cautious. When he reached the coop, he stood for a long time at its threshold, one hand resting on the worn wooden frame, the other gripping the hammer. He thought of his father again. How many times the old man must have walked this same path, utterly unaware, or perhaps unwilling to know. Maybe he had sensed the weight beneath, just as Marcus had before the boards came up. Maybe he'd chosen to ignore it, to keep the ghosts buried. Marcus began dismantling the coop board by board. He worked slowly, methodically, each nail pried free with care, each plank lifted as though it were a part of a grave. The smell of damp wood filled the air, mingling with the scent of churned soil and faint traces of iron. With each swing of the hammer, the building's shape dissolved a little more, and, as it did, a strange calm spread through him. It was not destruction, it was release. When the last section of roof came down, the rain began. Soft at first, then steady, it pattered against the exposed earth, running in thin rivulets over the edges of the chamber, where the archaeologists had left their protective tarp. The water made the red bricks glisten, their ancient lines darkening like blood. Marcus watched the rain seep into the soil, washing away the last fragments of straw and dust. For a moment, the pit looked almost alive, breathing with the rhythm of the falling drops. By midday, the coop was nothing but a pile of wood and nails. Marcus gathered what could still be used and stacked it neatly by the fence. He burned the rest in a small controlled fire near the field. The smoke rose thin and white, drifting eastward, disappearing into the thick clouds. The flames crackled quietly, and for a brief moment the scent of burning pine mingled with something sweeter, like incense. He took it as a sign, the past ascending, not in anger, but in farewell. When the rain subsided, he returned to the exposed chamber. The ground around it had softened, the earth rich and dark. He stood there for a long while, staring at the hollow below, now half filled with puddles that reflected the gray sky. It struck him that the place no longer felt like a wound. It was open, raw, yes, but also honest. The secrets it had guarded had been set free. The next morning, Marcus began the work of transformation. He had spent most of the night drawing plans in his notebook, simple sketches of what he wanted to build in place of the coop, not another structure of use, but one of remembrance. He went into town and bought a single slab of polished stone, pale and smooth to the touch. On it, he had engraved only a few words, "For those who waited in the dark." When the stone arrived, Marcus placed it carefully at the edge of the pit. The ground was still damp, the scent of rain lingering. He leveled the soil around it and pressed the stone firmly into place. It stood there, plain and unadorned, yet it seemed to command the space with quiet dignity. He circled the area with a simple wooden fence and lined the perimeter with small white stones. Then he went to the nursery in town and returned with 6 young rose bushes, white ones, the color of peace and remembrance. He planted them evenly along the fence line, their roots drinking deeply from the newly softened earth. As he worked, neighbors stopped by, curious to see what he was doing. Some offered to help. Old Henry came first, leaning on his cane, his weathered face unreadable. He stood by Marcus for a long time without speaking, his eyes fixed on the new stone. Finally, he said in his slow, gravelly voice, "You did right, boy. The land remembers. It always does. But now you've given it something worth remembering." Then he tipped his hat and walked back toward the road. Over the following days, more people came. Families, school teachers, even the local pastor. Some brought flowers, others simply stood quietly, their eyes reflecting the solemn respect that the place demanded. The County Historical Society promised to include the site on their registry of cultural landmarks, calling it the Reed Refuge. But Marcus didn't care for titles. To him, it was simply the ground telling its story the only way it knew how, through silence, through persistence, through time. The chickens, as if sensing the change, began to wander closer to the area again. They no longer avoided it, though they never crossed the fence that enclosed the memorial. Instead, they lingered nearby, scratching gently in the dirt, clucking softly, as though keeping a kind of vigil. Their presence comforted Marcus. It was as if the animals themselves understood the balance restored. Weeks passed. The roses took root quickly, their leaves glossy and dark, their first buds opening in the soft light of early morning. The air around the memorial smelled of rain and flowers now, not of decay or earth. Each day, Marcus visited the stone before tending to his new coop, which he had built farther down the property. The new structure was clean and bright, raised high on sturdy beams with a metal floor to keep out any burrowing creatures. It was practical and safe, but to Marcus it was more than that. It was a promise to the land, a way of saying that he had learned what it had to teach him. Every evening, as the sun dropped low and the fields turned gold, he sat by the stone for a while, watching the light fade across the roses. Sometimes he imagined he could hear faint whispers when the wind passed through the fence, soft, wordless sounds that felt like gratitude. He never spoke back aloud, but he felt a deep understanding settle within him, something beyond words or reason. He noticed that the farm seemed to thrive after that. The soil grew richer, the crops stronger, as if the earth, freed from its burden, had begun to give back. The air felt cleaner, the nights quieter, even his dreams changed. He no longer woke with the memory of creaking boards or the press of unseen eyes. Instead, he dreamed of open fields, of running water, of distant songs carried on the wind. One afternoon, as he repaired a fence near the back pasture, he saw a group of children walking with their teacher toward the memorial. They carried notebooks and cameras, their laughter light and respectful. Marcus watched from a distance as they gathered around the stone, the teacher reading from a page. He couldn't hear the words, but he knew what she was saying, that this land had once hidden a secret, a story of people who sought freedom in the dark, and that the man who owned it had chosen to remember, not to erase. The sight filled him with quiet pride. He had not set out to be a caretaker of history, but the role fit him nonetheless. He realized that stewardship was not only about land or animals or crops, it was about listening, to the earth, to the silence, to the things that whisper beneath the surface. That evening, as dusk descended, Marcus lit a small lantern and placed it beside the stone. Its warm glow flickered across the polished surface, illuminating the engraved words. The roses swayed gently in the breeze, their petals catching the faintest shimmer of light. He stayed there long after the stars appeared, his mind calm and untroubled. Before heading back to the house, he turned to look at the memorial once more. The night had grown cool, the sky a deep velvet blue. The lantern's flame wavered, but did not go out. In the stillness, Marcus felt the presence of something vast and kind, the quiet hum of continuity, the endless exchange between the living and the dead, between what was hidden and what was now revealed. He whispered softly into the darkness, "Thank you." The words drifted into the night air and were carried away, joining the chorus of crickets and the soft rustle of leaves. For the first time in weeks, the farm felt whole again. The land no longer carried a secret. It carried a story of endurance, of revelation, and of peace earned through remembrance. And as Marcus walked back to the house, the scent of roses lingered behind him, a promise that the past, once buried, could bloom again when given light. Months passed, and the rhythm of life on Marcus Reed's farm slowly returned to something resembling normalcy. The seasons rolled forward, gentle and steady, but nothing truly felt as it had before. The earth itself seemed changed, calmer, more aware, as though it had drawn a deep breath and settled after centuries of holding a secret beneath its surface. The small memorial at the edge of the yard became a natural part of the landscape, a quiet presence among the living things. Morning light often caught the edges of the stone, making it shimmer faintly in the dew. In the evenings, the roses cast long shadows that stretched towards the field, and the scent of their blossoms drifted through the open windows of Marcus's house, carrying with it something like peace. By late autumn, the harvest was complete. The corn was cut, the last of the melons sold at market, and the days began to shorten into quiet amber afternoons. Marcus worked with a renewed steadiness, though there was an unmistakable softness to his movements, as if each action carried new respect for the ground beneath him. He had come to understand that the land was not merely a possession, but a memory, an archive that remembered every life that had touched it. His own hands, his father's before him, and those who had come long before any of them, all were bound by the same soil. The realization humbled him every time he stepped outside. Sometimes, in the early hours before sunrise, Marcus would find himself drawn to the memorial without knowing why. He would stand among the roses as the world shifted from night to day, the air cool against his face, the silence deep enough to hear the faint hum of distant crickets. The stone was cold under his fingers, yet he always felt a kind of warmth in its presence, as though the earth beneath it remembered his touch and welcomed it. There were moments when he swore he could hear something, a faint whisper that rose and fell with the wind. It was not language, not even a sound exactly, but a sense of movement, like breath through leaves. He did not fear it anymore. What had once seemed ominous now felt familiar, a reminder that the past was never truly gone. The voices of those who had once hidden below his feet did not cry out for release anymore. They sang softly in gratitude. When he listened closely, he could almost feel their rhythm within the pulse of the land, the same quiet beat he had mistaken for unease all those weeks ago. The new coop stood at the far end of the yard, gleaming with fresh paint and metal trim that caught the morning sun. It was sturdy, modern, built with careful precision. Yet, despite its efficiency, Marcus rarely looked at it with the same affection he once had for the old one. That small, weathered structure, with all its mystery and decay, had changed his life in ways no bright new building ever could. Sometimes, as he watched the chickens pecking contentedly around the fence, he caught himself imagining the old coop still standing there, its door creaking in the wind, the faint smell of earth rising from beneath. But the memory did not sadden him. It was part of the story now, woven into the air, into the roots of the roses, into the breath of the farm itself. Winter crept in quietly. Frost spread across the fields, silvering the grass at dawn, and the trees along the property line turned skeletal, their bare branches scratching faintly against the sky. Marcus began to light fires earlier in the evenings, the orange glow flickering against the windows. The memorial looked different under frost, the roses stripped of leaves, the stone dusted with a thin layer of ice that shimmered like glass. He often stood at the window and watched it, the way the morning sun transformed it from gray to gold. It gave him comfort, that small proof that warmth could always return after the cold. One morning in late December, he woke before dawn to the sound of wind howling around the corners of the house. The storm that had been forecast all week had arrived early. Rain lashed the windows, and the air was thick with the smell of wet earth. Marcus pulled on his coat and boots, intending to check the new coop, worried that the wind might have loosened something. As he stepped outside, the cold rain hit his face in sharp bursts, soaking through his clothes almost instantly. The world was dark, the horizon lost in a haze of silver mist. When he reached the memorial, he paused. The roses bent under the force of the rain, their leaves trembling but unbroken. The stone stood firm, glistening beneath the downpour. Water pooled around its base, carrying small rivulets of soil into the grass. The earth seemed to breathe beneath his feet, drinking deeply from the storm. For a moment, Marcus felt the strangest sensation, that the rain was not washing the land but feeding it, renewing it. It struck him that even pain, when endured, could cleanse. By midday, the storm had passed. The sun broke through a gap in the clouds, spilling light across the drenched fields. Marcus walked the property, inspecting the fences and the new coop, which had weathered the storm without damage. The chickens pecked at the wet ground, unbothered, their feathers gleaming in the sun. When he returned to the memorial, a thin mist rose from the ground, curling around the base of the stone. It shimmered faintly in the sunlight, then drifted upward and vanished. Standing there, Marcus felt something shift inside him, subtle but profound. It was as if the land itself was saying farewell, closing a chapter. Not in sadness, but in acknowledgement. The chamber below had been uncovered, the story told, the dead remembered. Nothing more was required now but to live. He spent the following weeks attending to small repairs, mending tools, and cleaning the barn. Life had resumed its steady rhythm, but the farm seemed kinder to him somehow, its once stubborn fields yielding easily to his care. The earth that had once hidden so much now gave back in abundance. He felt the difference in the soil, rich and soft beneath his hands. Even the air smelled fresher. The weight that had pressed on him for months had lifted completely, replaced by a steady calm. On the first warm evening of spring, Marcus lit the lantern by the memorial for the first time since winter. The soft glow spread across the roses, now budding again, their petals unfolding with delicate patience. He sat on the small wooden bench he'd built nearby, the sound of frogs echoing faintly from the creek. The world was alive again, vibrant and breathing. He thought of all that had happened, the fear, the discovery, the unearthing of something both terrible and beautiful, and realized that the land had not cursed him. It had chosen him. He had been its witness. The thought settled in him like peace. The wind shifted, carrying the faint hum of crickets, and in that sound he heard it again, the echo. Not words, not sorrow, but a harmony that belonged to the soil itself. The earth was singing, quietly and endlessly, its song a blend of memory and renewal. Marcus closed his eyes and listened. He felt the vibration through his boots, through the bench, through the breath in his chest. It was the same rhythm that had frightened him once, now transformed into something holy. As the night deepened, he rose and placed his hand on the stone. It was warm from the lantern's glow. He whispered a few words, simple and heartfelt. "Rest easy. I'll take care of it." The words were not a promise to the dead alone, but to the living world that sustained him, to the fields, to the birds, to the endless hum beneath his feet. He stayed there until the stars began to scatter across the sky. The lantern flickered, casting small shifting halos of light over the roses. The crickets fell silent for a heartbeat, as if pausing to listen, and then resumed their song. Marcus smiled faintly, a man who had found his place not only upon the land, but within it. When he finally turned toward the house, he felt no need to look back. The stone, the roses, the earth, all of it would keep their watch. He walked slowly, his boots sinking softly into the damp ground, the smell of spring in the air. Behind him, the lantern flame wavered once, then steadied, its glow constant against the dark. And somewhere, deep beneath the soil, the echo lingered, not of fear nor of pain, but of remembrance. It was the sound of the land keeping its own quiet faith, the final heartbeat of a story that had found its peace. By the time Marcus reached his porch, the moon had climbed high, laying silver light across the fields. He stood for a moment, listening to the stillness. It was complete, unbroken, alive. The earth was at rest, and so was he. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe. There are many more incredible true stories waiting for you here. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss what's coming next. Watch our other videos to uncover more unbelievable discoveries, hidden secrets, and moments that change lives forever. And if this story surprised you, share it with your friends. Let them experience the mystery too. Because what happens next might just leave everyone speechless.